My name is Francis Shor. For 40 years, I taught at Wayne State University, first in a special program for working adults, and then was moved over to the history department, where I finished my 40-year career at Wayne State in 2014. So I've been retired for all of that time since 2014, but I've remained very active as a scholar writing books and as an activist participating in a variety of different campaigns. And so I often see some of the work, including the book that we'll be talking about today, as an interface between my activism and my academic background.
Well, thank you for writing the book. It is Weaponized Whiteness. I have it right here. And the subtitle is The Constructions and Deconstructions of White Identity Politics. And I'd like to get into kind of the idea of white identity politics in a minute, but if you could kind of give us an overview of what the book is about and what you hope to achieve in writing it.
Okay, thank you. So this is really a collection of essays, some of which were brand new for the book itself, and some of which were reworked from previous publications. And what I was hoping to do with the book is to provide a sense of both historical backdrop, the ability of understanding how and why white supremacy emerged over the long durée of American history, and then to try to put this into the context of understanding what was happening in a more contemporary period, and more specifically, also ways in which this wasn't, that is, the emergence of white supremacy and its persistence over time, wasn't something that was uncontested. In other words, it was constantly being challenged, whether it was by formerly enslaved people or abolitionists in the 19th century, or right up through civil rights, Black freedom activists, and Black Lives Matter activists. So I wanted to bring it all the way up to, in fact, Black Lives Matter. And I saw that as a definite confrontation with the idea of white identity politics, and a way, just as the civil rights movement had shown us towards some kind of common humanity, which I think is essential, that we need to understand, and the ways in which we embrace a multiracial democracy.
Yeah, and I think the book is incredibly well structured for kind of achieving what you set out to do. And you know, I was specifically struck by kind of how you just kind of went through history and picked out different moments in time where these contestations occurred, but then also the pushback of white identity politics. So before we get into some of the specifics, maybe you could give us an overview of what you see as white supremacy and then specifically white identity.
Yeah. Okay. So white supremacy, try to be as concise as possible, which is oftentimes difficult for academics. But since I'm a retired academic, maybe, but I'm older, so I can also continue with these digressions. So white supremacy emerges really in the 15th, 16th century with both what is called racial capitalism, that is the way in which people are exploited, dominated, controlled based upon skin color, religion, and it also emerges in what Sven Beckerts and others call war capitalism. In other words, it's part and parcel of what we understand to be the coming of the modern world, and the way then in which people of color in particular were dominated, controlled, exploited. In the case of Africans, that meant enslavement, and specifically that meant a kind of possession through brutal methods of torture, rape, etc. For the indigenous people of North America, that meant a form of dispossession, that is taking over their land and in effect destroying their culture by sweeping across the North American continent. Now, in the case with both one other factor I think that's fairly important, and a lot of people look at this as a kind of extremely important moment in Bacon's rebellion in the 17th century, when a series of both white indentured servants and ex-slaves or Black indentured servants came together to try to contest the power of the crown specifically. And this was broken up, and this wouldn't be the first time in history when whites and Blacks together, particularly in the South, through the populist era and through other moments in time, were that solidarity was destroyed with white supremacy. In other words, that became the tool to try to submerge class conflict and build racial solidarity among whites. And there's, of course, a wonderful song that Bob Dylan wrote back in the 1960s, Only a Pawn in Their Game. And this was pretty much about the Medgar Evers assassination. The idea being, again, poor whites were held by what, together with what W.B. Du Bois, in one of his famous works, called a psychological wage. That is, while they still, poor whites, working class whites, were still, being exploited, nonetheless, there was this psychological status that inhered in being white that could always be played upon. And I think over the long period, we've seen how white resentments and white paranoia have been used to mobilize a kind of tribalism and to create the kind of discordant notes in history and among those who would contest those in power.
Yeah, that's very much the white identity that you kind of identify, right? This cultivating of whiteness and how, so maybe you could kind of walk us through how that has happened, because we often hear this kind of statement that poor whites, even no matter how poor and destitute they were and oppressed, at least they weren't the other, Black,
Yes,
Native American.
right.
So you could kind of, yeah.
I think what's interesting is, and this might appeal in particular to people who are listening to this or people in the Cleveland area, since probably many of their family, excluding African Americans, came over at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, as my grandparents did. And those people who came over, if you look at the census, were not identified as whites, whether they were Polish or Greek or Italian or Jews. They were all identified as an other. And in effect, because it was a moment at which there was a panic among the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that they were being inundated by these foreigners, by these aliens. And this has been another trope that's been repeated, and particularly Trump mobilized it about building the wall and these alien others, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue of whiteness then becomes, and white identity politics is, how were the Irish able to become white? How were Italians able to become white? How were Jews able to become white? And it is submerging at some level, not just your sense of who you are in customary terms, in ritualistic terms, but actually who you identify with. Do you identify with this larger multiracial mix, as people did, certainly, or do you identify with the dominant power. And it's in effect that white identity politics, which people with a variety of ethnicities aspire to in order to gain a sense of status and power.
Yeah, and that status and power has changed over time, right? So,
Yes.
yeah, and one of the things that I really enjoyed about the chapter 3 was this notion of the neoliberalist power structure we live under now, and then also this how it cultivates, again, that word cultivates civic literacy. And it's something we hear a lot about today is how we're fractured and tribal and all this kind of stuff. But I think your point in that chapter is well made. So if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about
I think when we look at the present moment of crisis, it's easy, as perhaps even the Democrats have tried to do, is to say this is all about Trump. But Trump is in fact an epiphenomenon, Trumpism, of the larger neoliberal project, which has been to privatize public services, to erode a sense of the public, to create a notion that people are under siege, particularly white people. And so the idea then that I tried to write about in chapter 3, Trumpism, was to understand it within a larger socioeconomic context, within a larger political, cultural context. And then, so it's not enough just to, say, let's get rid of Trump and the problem's going to disappear. It's really about confronting the persistence of forms of white supremacy, whether it's through in policing or through various kinds of discriminations, housing, education, etc. And at the same time, understanding ways in which we can recreate a public that serves everyone and not just, as Bernie might say, the 1%.
Well, and it's interesting because one of the things I wrote down was this white identity politics of this kind of moment we're living in isn't new, obviously, but
right.
But this inflection and modification of privilege and advantage is the goal, right? I mean, that's so it's a reinvestment in white supremacy.
Right, and that concept of privilege is a little slippery because it's constantly, I think, informed by class and race and gender and geographical background. So a lot of it has to do then with a kind of stratified notion of privileging and what that means. And so, if you're a working class white person struggling in a rural area and dealing with all kinds of difficulties, health problems, employment problems, those sorts of things, your whiteness doesn't seem like a privilege at all. So I think it's important to understand the ways in which class, gender, race, class and gender, and other kinds of education all inform how it is that people are situated in a hierarchy. And it's ultimately trying to understand the way in which not only those at the top manipulate the situation, but how these circuits of power operate to create a sense of wanting to be, not disadvantaged. And often, instead of looking up at saying, where is, how is it that we are stuck in this kind of structural inequity, but looking down or looking aside at others. So that's part of what I try to sketch out in the way in which white identity politics operates.
Well, that's an interesting point too, because the looking up is aspirational. So if white people are still at the top, me as a lower class, poorer white, I have that as, that I can make it to that top.
Yes.
As the people of color are getting away with something.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the system, right?
That's it. And I think it was John Steinbeck who said, many Americans are frustrated millionaires, and the idea that somehow we have this aspirational notion that we can all be winners, when that whole notion of a zero-sum game is part and parcel of what keeps us at each other, instead of understanding the ways in which this is not that kind of a zero-sum game, that we all do better when we all do better, so to speak.
Well, and then that I was very interested in the chapter you wrote about the student involvement in the civil rights movement, because you kind of expand upon this notion of white identity politics within the civil rights movement, and that was incredibly fascinating to me. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, I wanted to go back and actually do a kind of biographical or autobiographical intervention in this, because the 60s, growing up as as an activist in the 60s, the first thing that, of course, catalyzed my sense of political consciousness was the civil rights movement. I started the University of Pittsburgh in 1963, and that was a tremendously important year in what was to happen with the civil rights movement. And I immediately got involved in it and understood that even though I was engaged with what was called the Friends of SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, northern allies of the Southern movement for political rights, etc. I had to confront the fact that I could easily just go back to where I was, in a suburb of Pittsburgh, and be relatively well off, so the idea that there was something that I brought with me that I needed to struggle over, that when I was coming, I had to understand that I brought with me certain privileges, right? And looking at those as both on an individual level, and then understanding it historically for what informed the work of white students who became active in the civil rights struggle, was what I tried to do in that chapter. So I weave in and out of my own coming to consciousness around what I call unveiling whiteness, and understanding what that meant, and ultimately understanding, as one of those activists, Mendy Semstein, said, in joining the movement for Black freedom, it wasn't just as a way of only helping someone else. It was really understanding, as Bob Moses would say also later, in getting students to come down from Mississippi Freedom Summer, that you're trying to become more than who you are as a white person. In other words, as Mendy Semstein said, I wanted to become part of the human race. I wanted to be on equal footing, in a way, to welcome to be in this larger group of people who were dedicated to equality and freedom.
When I think that struggle continues for white people, because that unveiling and that destabilization of whiteness is a process that, we're not used to confronting as white people. And
Yeah.
being of Robin DiAngelo's work in this and that
Right.
kind of, yeah.
And I think in Black Lives Matter, that was a tremendously important moment in those demonstrations where you saw hundreds of demonstrations around the country of in places, small places too, where white people came out and understanding in the aftermath um, of what had transpired with the murders of any number of African Americans, that something had to change, and that something also meant that white people had to confront what it meant, why Black Lives mattered, and what that meant in terms of our history and what it meant in terms of how we changed and transformed the social system.
Well, and in reading that chapter in chapters 4 and 5, basically, I was struck by the progression of the police. And had the police had the tools and the tactics they have today, back in the 60s, we would have seen a different civil rights movement, I think. And just the confrontation of the police in the Black Lives Matter movement was so drastically. I mean, the tactics are the same, right? They're doing the crowd control and that kind of stuff, but the equipment and the look of it, so much more.
Yeah, and I think that's important to understand that what happened at the end of the 20th century was the militarization, even more so, the militarization of police. Actual transfer from the Pentagon of weapons of war, of armaments, of strategies, which created an even more militarized response and a way of looking at people who challenged the status quo as enemies, not not as fellow citizens. For African Americans, that's always been something that they've had to contend with. That is, that somehow they weren't part of this white citizenship. They weren't entitled to full citizenship by the way in which the police would operate in their communities. And, that out of the 60s, that whole movement to say, we want some control over this policing that goes on in a community, that had various representations all the way through the Black Panther Party. But it certainly also was represented in the way in which some Black politicians were able to win finally mayoral races here in Detroit. Mayor Coleman Young was able to win in 1973, building on what had been the outrage over what was called Stress, program by police that wound up killing at least one Black man every week. So the outrage, not only within the Black community, but also among civil libertarians was palpable. And it led to these kinds of coalitions that I think brought about a change in the way in which power was distributed, even though it didn't ultimately, overturn a system.
Oh, right. And it seems like it's as with everything we've seen in American history, there's civil rights movement forward, and then there's kind of this blowback. And it seems to me, just looking at the protests, you're protesting police brutality, and the answer is more police brutality. But then there's the spectacle of the burning buildings and the looting and all that kind of stuff, which plays into that media scape we have of gangs and why we need to militarize the police in the first place.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's,
exactly. Yeah, I think that's true. There's a way in which the corporate media plays upon this society of the spectacle and turns the flashpoints of destruction into the defining moment of it. In fact, when it was, of all the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, was probably 1% that had that, as opposed to the 99% that was, that was peaceful. Yeah, so
well, that gets back to that civil illiteracy we were talking about before, where it's, you need to have that like flashpoint, as you said, to kind of drive home the fear, which keeps
right.
white identity in place.
Right, right, yeah. That's the sort of feedback loop that unfortunately still operates. But I think one of the things that's been, particularly in light of just the Ahmaud Arbery case, that just, and the what's transpired with the trial and with the court, the verdict, is that people are now being held accountable for these acts of terror, of white terror, which have, right up through the 60s, many of these were still countenanced, certainly by Southern juries. When you look at how long it took to bring, as I talk about in one of the chapters, how long it took to bring some of these murderers of civil rights activists to trial, and even to a fair-minded verdict. Now I think maybe with the kind of phone video that we have, pictures being taken, you can get the goods on people, so to speak, and create an environment where these outlandish sorts of behavior and these terror tactics are best revealed and unveiled, and then some sort of justice can be brought to bear.
It's those massive cases that really are egregious,
Right.
Are national news, but there's daily
Right.
events that happen that still happen within, I think, this system of judicial. It may not be as overtly racist
Right.
as it was, but it's
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things, and I talk a little bit about this in the book also, one of the things that came out in the Ferguson, Ferguson killing of Michael Brown, was that, there were all these daily infractions that Black people had to contend with, because police would cite them for a broken taillight, and then they'd get into court, or they'd have some problem with the court date, and all of these things would be compounded. The injustices would be compounded. And then if the studies have been done in any number of places which show that policing, when it comes to giving out tickets or harassing or even murdering Black people, is way greater than it is with in the white community. And so that's a concern when people talk about the need to reimagine what policing is, to think about public safety in a way that doesn't create these kinds of injustices against people of color. That's still an absolute need. And of course, you can pick up a bad slogan like defund the police and say that, oh my God, they're going to take away all the money from. No, the idea is, look at, we want to free up the police from having to do social work. They shouldn't have to do social work. They shouldn't have to be giving out, we've got cameras everywhere. You don't need to give out tickets anymore. remove those burdens from the police, and have them just deal with, real problems that exist, and not the kinds of things that have led to these awful moments when people have died. Black people in particular have died because of police interactions.
Well, and the thing, I just interviewed Professor Nadahoff about the misdemeanor system. And one of
Yes.
that was brought up in that interview was the fact that, warrant sounds so ominous.
Yes.
He has outstanding warrants, but when you actually look at the warrants, they're for broken taillights.
Right.
Non-payment of tickets and like these kind of traffic infractions that are not, when you think of warrants as like, oh, he did something bad.
Yeah.
It's just this really a tax on the poor.
Yeah, I mean, we just drove out east, and of course, going on the Ohio Turnpike, we finally broke down about an easy pass. Now, for God's sakes, you got an easy, you can just hook up these things to cars. You don't need to have police doing this kind of traffic violations, which can snowball, as they often have, into racial confrontations with deadly consequences for people of color. So there are ways of thinking through what we need to do in order to get away from what has historically been a punitive system that has in particular victimized people of color.
Well, and I think this is a good point to bring up, or a good point in the interview to talk about what actually weaponizing whiteness entails and what that looks like in your conception. Because
so what I was trying to do really in saying, look, there are two areas that I think are historically important to understand how it is that white supremacy becomes a dominating means of control. And at the same time that while it changes over time because of the changes in social historical conditions, it also is a situation where because of the persistence of certain kinds of policing and the persistence of certain kinds of warfare, those two together have to be understood. In building an American empire, in particular, the idea of creating a white republic was front and center, certainly through all the way through the 20th century. And the vision of the United States coming out of World War II that Henry Luce, the editor and owner of Time Life, talked about, that the United States would be the great controller of the world and establishing what Western civilization had given to everyone. Forgetting, of course, the whole history of slavery and other sorts of things, but and genocide. So so what you had was this project of weaponizing whiteness was part and parcel of establishing things like slave patrols that Sally Haddon wrote an amazing book about that you had her on earlier. Using the Second Amendment, which most people still misunderstand. It wasn't really about trying to prevent governmental tyranny as much as it was to try to guarantee that the South would be able to have their state militias to put down slave revolts. So the Second Amendment is part and parcel of the interface of the emergence of the white republic and white empire, and also policing. For a long time, African Americans were denied the right to have weapons You know, that was seen as a violation of laws, of the legal structure.
Well, I also thought it was a really apt way of putting it, because so much of whiteness is fear of people who aren't white. And, you know, you need a weapon to protect yourself from these people. And one of the weapons we deploy is whiteness. And it just made, because I mean, when you're talking about the militias and that kind of thing, we need other states to come in, because we didn't have enough white people to keep the black people from killing us all, the slaves from killing us all. So
well, the fear was also that the federal government, and this is, we're talking now the 18th century and the construction of the Constitution. The fear was, and Madison was certainly aware of that, because he was a Virginian and a slave owner, and you know, so he was well aware that the fear by his fellow Virginians was that the federal government would have its own control over the state militias. And then, given that there was much more abolitionist tendencies in the North, that might mean that South couldn't control their state militias to put down these slave revolts. So, you know, that's how the Second Amendment came around. But it's been the NRA's effort over many decades to convince people that this is all about the tyranny of government, and that everybody has a right to unarmed. And of course, the Supreme Court, starting with Scalia, is, you know, in their decision about the right to be armed, for everyone to be armed, is in fact a breaking of the precedent of most Supreme Court decisions still recognizing the first part of that, a well-regulated militia. It has nothing to do with the right to bear arms by each individual, but it had direct connection to state militias, which in turn were seen as instruments of putting down slave revolts and of wiping out native peoples.
I mean, it's right, absolutely horrible when it is put in those terms, and you know, the historical framework. But I think the last thing I wanted to kind of touch on was, you know, how we can challenge, and you kind of bring this up in the last two chapters in the epilogue, but how do we challenge going forward? Or what advice would you give for someone who's trying to kind of vacate some of these issues in their own?
Yeah, I do try to pick that up from both the, you know, what Black Lives Matter was able to raise as the larger question, and not just in policing, but the way in which discriminatory policies operate, have operated historically, and they still persist. But and also what that means in terms of being in solidarity, not feeling operating out of guilt, but operating out of the sense that in the process of creating a society that treats people with respect and dignity, that we create a better society for all of us. So looking forward, it's really a question of how we change the power dynamic. How we understand that you can't have this kind of inequality, which has gotten even worse over the last decades. You can't have this kind of inequality and still create a sense of security and equality. So that needs to be challenged. That's obviously a class and a question of socioeconomics. In terms of the political culture, we have to understand ways in which the whole effort of suppressing the votes, of the fact that we have these remnants from a slave constitution, of the Electoral College, of the Senate, you know, we need to think very deeply about what it means to change our political system so we really do have one person, one vote. We don't have that now. And then, you know, it's very clear that there are many Republicans who say they don't want a democracy. They're afraid of it, as indicated by the vote in Kansas, right? When people get a chance to vote, they're going to vote some common sense understanding of what it means to have respect and dignity and some kind of bodily autonomy. And going forward, we also need to think about the ways in which we just operate on a day-to-day basis, which means that, you know, removing those kinds of fear and paranoia which surrounds us in the mediascape and is built into when you have inequality, when you have the kind of disequilibrium in the system, when you have so many people disadvantaged, you know, and people, you know, in many of cities where you have unhoused people having to live out on the street, you know, creates more sense of the specter of fear and paranoia. So all of those things, I think, need to be addressed, and it's not going to be any one thing. There's no magic wand that we can wave. And that's why it is a matter of will. It's really a matter of political will. It's a matter of our own making choices about how we want a future for ourselves, our kids, our grandkids, and the planet.